Are you ready to face something that has no name but leaves scars? It's time to discover what lies beyond the light. Only if you are ready to face the deepest horror should you step inside. We're opening doors to a world where every rustle hides a dreadful secret, and every step might be your last. What evil lurks behind these walls? What dark forces awaken in the night's silence? What happens when your deepest fears begin to haunt your consciousness? Leave all hope and comfort behind. Turn on the light if you dare, and be ready to discover what hides in the darkest corners of your fear.
In a small town where every house seemed to share the same storybook charm, lived a young woman named Clara. Her days were filled with routine and predictability. She worked at the local library, surrounded by the comforting scent of old books and the quiet rustle of pages turning. Her evenings were spent in her modest home, nestled between towering trees that whispered secrets when the wind blew. Clara led an ordinary life in an ordinary town. Yet, the attic of her house was a realm untouched by time. It was cluttered with remnants of the past. Dust danced in the beams of sunlight that trickled through the small window. One rainy afternoon, Clara decided to explore the attic. It had been years since she ventured up the rickety stairs. With each creak beneath her feet, she felt a slight shiver crawl down her spine. As she sifted through boxes filled with forgotten trinkets, she stumbled upon an old, faded photograph. The image was yellowed with age, the edges frayed. It depicted a gathering of people, their faces frozen in a moment of joy. But something about the photograph felt off. As she examined it closely, Clara noticed how the smiles of the individuals seemed too wide, their eyes glimmering with an unsettling intensity. She could not shake the feeling that they were looking right through her. Clara set the picture aside, but an inexplicable unease lingered. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image from her mind. The faces began to haunt her dreams, twisting and morphing into shadows that danced at the edge of her consciousness. When she awoke the next morning, the photograph remained on her mind, a weight she could not ignore. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and glanced at the photograph resting on her dresser. To her horror, she noticed that one of the faces had changed. A woman, once smiling with a carefree air, now wore an expression of longing. It was subtle, but Clara could feel the shift in energy. The woman's eyes seemed to bore into Clara's own, pleading for something unspoken. Panic gripped her heart. Had she imagined it? A trick of the light? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. Clara began to notice changes in her surroundings. The familiar creaks of her home felt different, imbued with a presence she could not define. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows that flickered and faded before she could fully comprehend them. Clara felt a pull towards the photograph, an urge to uncover the truth hidden within its faded colors and eerie smiles. That night, the dreams intensified. She found herself standing in a vast, sunlit field, the photograph clutched tightly in her hands. The figures from the photo danced around her, their laughter ringing in her ears. But something was off. Their movements were too fluid, too unnatural. Clara felt an overwhelming sense of unease as their smiles twisted into expressions of mockery. She woke again, her heart racing. The shadows in her room were now unmistakable. She could see the silhouettes of the figures watching her from the edges of her vision. She tried to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched was palpable, suffocating. As she passed by the hallway mirror, a fleeting glimpse caught her eye, a figure standing just behind her, its form indistinct yet unmistakably present. Clara spun around, heart pounding, but found only her own reflection staring back at her, wild-eyed and pale. She was brushing her teeth. As she leaned over the sink, she caught sight of a silhouette standing behind her in the mirror. It was a man, his wide-brimmed hat casting shadows over his eyes. Clara gasped, nearly dropping her toothbrush. The reflection smirked, a grin that sent chills racing down her spine. She started avoiding reflective surfaces altogether, convinced that the figures were waiting for a moment of weakness, a brief lapse in her resolve to pull her into their world. As the lines between reality and the supernatural blurred, Clara felt isolated in her fear. Friends and family noticed her growing paranoia, but dismissed her concerns as stress from work. "It's just your imagination," they would say, their voices dripping with skepticism. But Clara knew better. She could feel the presence of those figures watching her every move, their intentions obscured but undeniably sinister. The photograph had become a curse, binding her to a fate she could not understand. In a desperate move, Clara sought the help of an old woman known for her knowledge of the supernatural, Miss Agnes, a local eccentric who dabbled in the paranormal. Clara recounted her harrowing experiences, her voice trembling as she spoke of the figures that had taken over her life. Miss Agnes listened intently, her eyes narrowing with understanding. "These spirits are drawn to your energy, Clara," she warned. "They may have been trapped in that photograph, and now they seek to break free." With Miss Agnes's guidance, Clara attempted to conduct a cleansing ritual. In her quest for understanding, Clara found herself drawn back to the attic, the source of the haunting. The air grew thick with anticipation as she ascended the stairs, the creaking wood beneath her feet sounding like a warning. The photograph lay there, unchanged, but she could sense the energy radiating from it, pulsating like a living thing. Clara could no longer ignore the unsettling reality that had become her life. The figures from the photograph had transitioned from mere shadows in her home to intrusive neighbors, manifesting in her day-to-day existence. Their presence was suffocating, an ever-watchful audience that scrutinized her every move. As she stood there, paralyzed by a mix of dread and curiosity, Clara felt a sudden rush of wind, as if the very air was alive. The figures began to emerge from the photograph, their forms spilling into the attic like ink in water. Clara stumbled backward. As the ritual progressed, Clara could feel their anger boiling over, manifesting as a chilling wind that whipped through the room. The lights flickered, and the whispering voices grew louder, drowning out her words. Just as she felt she might succeed, the old man from the photograph appeared before her, his face twisted in rage. "You cannot escape us," he bellowed, his voice a thunderous echo that reverberated through the walls. Clara's heart raced as she felt the weight of the figures closing in around her, their shadows engulfing her in darkness. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice trembling yet defiant. The old man stepped forward, his cane tapping against the floor with each deliberate movement. "You awakened us, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the attic. "You have drawn us back into the world we once inhabited. We are bound to you now, and we will not be dismissed so easily." Clara's heart raced as she processed his words. She was the key, the bridge between their world and hers, and they would not rest until they consumed her essence completely. "I will not let you take me," she cried, clenching her fists. She had come too far to back down, now she had to fight for her life. With a flick of her wrist, Clara produced a small vial of salt she had prepared with Miss Agnes's guidance. She poured a line across the floor, creating a barrier between herself and the advancing figures. The old man halted, his eyes narrowing in frustration. "You think mere salt can keep us at bay? We are beyond such trivialities." Undeterred, Clara shouted the words from the incantation. For a moment, Clara felt a surge of power, a connection to something ancient and primal. But then, the shadows began to seep through the cracks, creeping closer, determined to break her resolve. Suddenly, the young girl with the doll lunged forward, her face a mask of fury. "You cannot escape, Clara. We were trapped for so long, and now you must pay the price." The girl's laughter echoed, a chilling sound that reverberated through Clara's bones. The shadows thickened, swirling around her like a tempest, and Clara felt her strength waning. In a moment of desperation, Clara recalled the words Miss Agnes had taught her about harnessing the light within. She closed her eyes, focusing on the warmth radiating from her heart, channeling it into her voice as she cried, "I reject you. I reclaim my life." The attic exploded with blinding light, the shadows recoiling as they were pushed back by the intensity of her declaration. Clara could feel the energy surging through her, amplifying her resolve. But the figures fought back, their forms distorting and merging into a single monstrous entity, a grotesque amalgamation of their features that loomed before her, its eyes burning with rage. "You think you can defeat us so easily?" it roared, the walls trembling at its voice. "We are the darkness that feeds on fear, and you are but a flicker of light in our realm." The entity lunged at Clara, and she stumbled backward. The shadows clawed at her, but she stood firm, the salt barrier shimmering with an ethereal glow. With each chant, she felt the light within her growing stronger, illuminating the space around her. The power of her conviction surged, and she reached deep within herself, amplifying the light until it enveloped her completely. The entity hissed, its form writhing as it was forced to retreat. Clara could see the faces of the figures twisted in agony, their forms flickering like dying flames. In that moment, she realized that she held the power to sever the connection. With one final defiant shout, she unleashed the light that had been building within her. It burst forth like a shockwave, enveloping the attic in blinding brilliance. The figures screamed, their voices a cacophony of anguish as they were pulled back into the photograph, their forms disintegrating into wisps of shadow. As the light faded, Clara collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The attic was silent once more. The oppressive weight of the shadows lifted. She looked around, half expecting the figures to return, but the space was empty, the photograph lying in tatters on the floor. Clara felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her. In that moment of victory, Clara understood that she was no longer a victim of her own curiosity. She had fought back against the shadows and emerged stronger, ready to reclaim her life and banish the fear that had threatened to consume her. In a final act of defiance, she tore the photograph in half, determined to sever the connection that bound them to her. Clara awoke the next morning to golden sunlight streaming through her window, illuminating the remnants of her battle against the shadows. The attic lay silent, the weight of the oppressive presence lifted. She felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her, the shadows that had once enveloped her life now reduced to mere echoes in her memory. Clara spent the day tending to her home, meticulously cleaning every corner as if to rid herself of any remnants of the haunting. She felt lighter, free from the torment of the figures that had invaded her life. Friends and family noticed her newfound energy and brightened demeanor, and Clara reveled in their warmth and support. The ordinary moments of laughter and connection filled her heart with vitality. But as she glanced into the mirror one evening, she was caught off guard by a faint flicker in her reflection. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as a trick of the light. But the flicker grew more pronounced, morphing into a clear image of the old man, his eyes filled with a haunting familiarity. He stood behind her, smiling that same sinister grin she had come to dread. Panic surged through her as she stumbled back, instinctively reaching for the amulet Miss Agnes had given her. But it was too late. The figure stepped forward, breaking the barrier of reality, his form solidifying. "You thought you could escape us, Clara," he rasped. "You are one of us now, and we will always be with you." The torn photograph lay in the center of the room, pulsating with a faint energy that beckoned her closer. In the dim light, Clara could see the faces shifting within the photograph, their expressions filled with longing and malice. She felt the pull of their essence, a gravitational force that drew her in. With trembling hands, she reached out to touch the photograph, and in that instant, everything changed. The attic exploded with blinding light, and Clara was thrust into a whirlwind of images, memories, fears, and desires flooding her senses. She was no longer just Clara, she was a vessel for the darkness. As the light faded, Clara stood in the attic, transformed. The figures surrounded her, their whispers a melodic chorus that echoed in her mind. They were no longer her enemies, they were her companions. each one a piece of a puzzle she could never fully understand. Clara gazed into the mirrors, her reflection a kaleidoscope of faces, hers and theirs intertwined in a tapestry of light and shadow. The lingering sense of unease settled in her chest like an old friend, a reminder that she had chosen this path. The haunting laughter echoed in her ears, a reminder that the darkness was not an enemy to be defeated, but a part of her existence she would have to embrace. The attic, once a place of fear, had become a sanctuary, a realm where she was both the light and the shadow, forever intertwined in a story that would never truly end.